Have you ever had a fabric sitting in your stash so long you forgot where you got it? But when you finally get around to using it, it makes the perfect fabric for the pattern that you're working with. I dug this soft flannel out of my stash and it made the perfect fabric for the Paola Workwear Jacket. This is a free pattern available at fabricstore.com. I'm sewing this pattern today a little bit differently from the pattern instructions. I'm choosing to skip the flat-felled seams and just serge my seams to finish and then top stitch them down. This also creates a nice durable seam and the same aesthetic on the outside of the garment. It's just a little bit easier to sew it this way. But if you are interested in sewing the flat-felled seams, take a look at a very similar free pattern sew-along on this channel, the Peppermint West End Jacket, where I demonstrate how to create the flat-felled seams throughout the garment. I'm using tape in this video to designate the wrong side of the fabric because the right and wrong side look the same. I hope you join me today in sewing this practical seasonal garment. Let's get started. Here are one of my upper and lower pockets. I'm going to start by finishing the side and bottom edges for both pocket sets. Now that those side and bottom edges are finished, I'm going to take each pocket to the ironing board and fold and press the side and bottom edges to the wrong side by 1/4 of an inch. Once those side and bottom edges are pressed to the wrong side by 1/4 of an inch, you're also going to press the top edge to the wrong side by 1 inch and then again by 1 1/4 inches. Then you're going to edge stitch from one side to the other along that bottom fold, doing this for all 4 pockets. The pattern instructions also give you the option of adding a second row of top stitching 1/4 of an inch above that first row. Here is the right side of one of my front bodice pieces. I've transferred the tops of my pocket markings to the front bodice just using pins. Now I'm going to place the wrong side of my upper pocket along those top pin markings and pin in place along the side and bottom edges. And I'll do the same to place my lower pocket along those bottom pin markings. Now I'm going to take these pockets to the sewing machine and edge stitch close to those side and bottom edges all around the pocket, back stitching at the beginning and end of my stitches. Additionally, you could choose to do an extra row of top stitching 1/4 of an inch away from those edges. Place your front and back bodice pieces right sides together, matching your shoulder seams and pin in place. Now I'm going to sew the shoulders at a 5/8 inch seam allowance and finish the edges together. Now here are my front and back pieces and my shoulder seams opened out. I've taken my seam allowances and pressed them toward the back of the garment. Now from the front of the garment, I'm going to top stitch along that seam allowance 1/4 of an inch away from the original stitching line, from one side of the shoulder to the other, doing this for both sides. Apply interfacing to the wrong sides of your front and back facing pieces. Then place these pieces right sides together and pin the shoulder seams. And then sew those shoulder seams with a 3/8 inch seam allowance. Once you've sewn those seams, press the seam allowances open. Then we're going to finish the outside edges of our facing all the way around in your preferred method. I'm going to be using my serger. Apply interfacing to the wrong side of your undercollar piece. Then place your upper and undercollar pieces right sides together, and then pin in place along the outer edges. And then sew your collar pieces together along those outer edges with a 3/8 inch seam allowance. Trim your seam allowances and your outer corners, and then turn your collar right side out, poking out those corners. And then give your collar a good press. Then take your collar to the sewing machine and we're going to top stitch along those outer edges with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Here is my bodice neckline opened out. I'm going to place the interfaced undercollar, right sides together with the bodice at the neckline, matching the raw edges and the center backs, and pin in place. I'm also going to match the notches on my collar with the shoulder seams and pin in place, and then match the outer edges of my collar with the notches marked at the top of my neckline and pin in place. Now we can start pinning the facing right sides together with the bodice, sandwiching the collar in between. Once again, matching up those shoulder seams and the corner edges. Then continue pinning those facings to your center fronts, noting that the facing is intentionally shorter than the center front of the bodice. And pin in place on both sides. Then we'll take it to the sewing machine and sew from one end of the facing all the way up and across the neckline and back down to the bottom of the facing on the other side, using a 3/8 inch seam allowance. Now we can trim those seam allowances all the way around, as well as trimming the corners. Continuing to trim that seam allowance around the neckline as well, and clip into the curves of the neckline, careful not to clip through your stitching line. Then we can turn the facing to the inside of the garment, poking out those top corners, and give all of those facing seams a good press. Once we've pressed all those facing edges, we're going to take the garment to the sewing machine and top stitch along the center front with a 1/4 inch seam allowance, continuing at the top of that lower collar and right below that neckline collar seam straight across, pivoting once again at the other side of that lower collar and continuing that 1/4 inch seam allowance all the way to the bottom of the garment. Now that I've top stitched all the way around, I'm going to work from the inside of the garment to pin those outer finished edges of the facing to the garment all the way around. Now that that's pinned in place, I'm going to edge stitch close to those finished edges of the facing as pinned, all the way along that center front, around that neckline, and back down across that opposite center front. Now with my front and back bodices opened out flat, with right sides together, I'll match one of my sleeves with the corresponding arm side, making sure to match the notches on the sleeve and the bodice that indicate front and back. Also line up the notch at the top of your sleeve with your shoulder seam and pin in place. Then I can take my sleeve to the sewing machine and sew it in place with a 5/8 inch seam allowance, and then finish those raw edges together. Here is the top of the sleeve that we just sewed and finished. You're going to press that seam allowance toward the bodice, and then just as we did when we reinforced those shoulder seams, we're going to take it to the sewing machine and sew the seam allowance to the bodice 1/4 inch away from the original stitching line. Now with your front and back pieces right sides together, pin the side seams and the underarm seams on one side, making sure to match up those underarm seams. Now we're going to sew in one continuous seam with a 5/8 inch seam allowance from the bottom of the jacket across the underarm and to the bottom of the sleeve. Then we're going to finish the seams and press them toward the back of the garment. Then you're going to top stitch that seam allowance in place with a 1/4 inch seam allowance, just as we did to reinforce the shoulders and the top of the sleeves. As you're top stitching the side seam and the underarm seam with that 1/4 inch seam allowance, it may not be possible to feed that entire sleeve through your machine in one direction. So as you're sewing from the bottom of the garment, you can top stitch as far as you can down that sleeve, and then break up the stitching, starting again at the bottom of the sleeve, and top stitching once again until you meet those stitches that you stopped at. And repeat all of those steps on the other side to complete your other sleeve and your opposite side seam. Now for the bottoms of the sleeves, you can try on your jacket to determine how deep of a hem you want to create. I've folded that raw edge to the wrong side by about 2 inches, and then I'm going to roll that hem by tucking that raw edge inside so that that raw edge now meets that crease on the inside, and then pin all along that folded edge on the inside of the garment. And repeat for the bottoms of both sleeves. Now I'll take these hems to the sewing machine and edge stitch close to that inner fold all the way around both sleeves. Now for the bottom hem of the garment, I've folded the bottom raw edge to the wrong side by 3/8 of an inch, and then I folded it once more to the wrong side by 1 inch. Now I'll pin in place all the way across. This hem that we created should just cover the bottom of that facing. Now that I have that hem pinned all the way across, I'm going to take it to my sewing machine and edge stitch close to that inner fold all the way from one center front to the other. Now along my left front bodice, I'm going to use my front pattern piece to mark my buttonhole markings along the center front edge. Then I'll take it to my sewing machine and create 5 vertical buttonholes. Now placing my left bodice over my right, I've marked with pins where I want my buttons to go. And now I can sew my buttons in place. Now our jacket is complete. Thank you for watching this sew along. Make sure you check out the rest of my video library for more great sewing inspiration, and I'll see you in the next video.